Let's be real for a second. There is a ton of writing advice on the internet that is frankly bad, not helpful, and in some cases, just counterproductive. As a professional book editor who's worked at 2 of the big 5 US publishing houses, as well as a top literary agency, my goal with this channel is to bring you truly helpful and practical advice that you can immediately start applying to your manuscript and seeing results. I'm really passionate about helping aspiring authors with actionable advice and insights that strengthens your story and helps you navigate the very confusing publishing process. So with that, I want to highlight 5 pieces of writing advice that I disagree with and frankly think is bad. These are pieces of advice that I think you should honestly ignore, and I'm going to explain what I would recommend doing instead. If you're anywhere along the book writing or publishing journey, I recommend subscribing to my channel. Every week, I either talk through writing advice like this one or offer insights on the publishing industry, and I would love to have you around. So let's talk about the first piece of bad writing advice, which is that exposition is the enemy. A common piece of writing advice is to not spend time giving the reader information about the characters' backstories or explaining any background context about their situation, which is what we call exposition, because the argument is that the reader is smart enough to figure it out on their own and you should just keep going with the story. While it's true that you don't want to spoon feed everything to your reader, and they should be able to figure out certain things as the story progresses, some amount of backstory is actually necessary for the reader to get oriented in the story and for them to get a clear picture of the novel's world, the characters, and what is at stake in the story. This is especially true for the critical first pages of your book. If there is no exposition whatsoever, it is going to be very difficult for the reader to get grounded in the story, for them to even get hooked and intrigued to continue reading. You might lose them before you even begin if you don't give them some sense of who the characters are, where they are, what the context of their situation is, and what the conflict of the plot is building to. Effective exposition comes down to a delicate balance of giving the reader enough information to feel situated in the story and follow the action of the plot, but not so much that you end up taking them out of the story for prolonged periods of time. You do not want to provide pages and pages of exposition, or even in most cases, paragraphs and paragraphs of exposition. It really should be woven throughout the main narrative and integrated organically so that it becomes a natural part of your story. I have a video on how to nail the opening pages of your story, so I recommend checking that out if you are worried about making sure you're hitting the right balance of exposition and action in those pages. The next piece of writing advice that I think you should avoid is to aim for literary style writing. Have you ever read a passage that is just so dense with imagery and SAT vocab words that it's difficult to interpret what the actual meaning is? You can tell when a writer is trying to elevate their writing and make it sound more literary. But remember that quote-unquote literary writing is not by any means necessarily better. If you have any question on what I mean when I'm using terms like literary or commercial or upmarket, I recommend checking out my video where I go through all of the different fiction genres and what those terms mean. Trying too hard to make your writing sound literary can actually turn into what we call purple prose. And that is when there is just too much overly verbose or ornate language that actually obscures the meaning of what's trying to be conveyed. This type of language will also immediately become distracting to the reader. So I really recommend letting your writing take whatever style feels natural and organic to you. You can and should always work to improve your writing craft, but do not feel the need to fit a specific mold or to even classify your writing as literary. The third piece of bad writing advice is to never write a prologue. There is a lot of debate in the author communities about whether or not to include a prologue. And it honestly kind of surprised me because when I worked in the publishing industry, the editors and agents that I worked with never really had an issue with well-done prologues. They never expressed that there was some kind of blanket ban on prologues or deem them unacceptable in any scenarios. My view is that for some novels, a well-crafted prologue can actually be quite effective. especially if you are writing historical fiction or thrillers and teasing some of the plot action that is to come later on. But of course, as with honestly any scene in your novel, if it is poorly executed, it is going to be distracting to the reader, and you should not include a prologue just for the sake of it. So if you find yourself leaning towards a prologue or feeling like a specific scene could hook the reader's interest right at the beginning of the story, don't feel like it's off limits at all. A good prologue, in my opinion, actually really helps a lot with framing the story effectively and hooking the reader's interest to see what's to come. The next piece of bad writing advice is that every story needs an antagonist or a villain character. Now, it may be immediately clear to you, maybe it was even clear before you even started writing the novel, who your antagonist or villain is, and that is perfectly fine and that is great. However, if you are struggling to figure out who the antagonist or villain is and it's keeping you up at night, don't worry, because your story doesn't necessarily need a character that is an antagonist or a villain. It's simply not true that every protagonist has to have an antagonist character. And actually, some of the most captivating and compelling stories are the ones where there isn't a character who is acting out as an antagonist or a villain. There doesn't always need to be this single identifiable person that represents all of the evil and negative energy in your story. Because remember that sometimes in life, not one thing or person can be put to blame for everything that happens to us. Sometimes there are stories where characters are just grappling with whatever life throws their way. And that is perfectly valid, and that can be just as captivating as a story that has a clear enemy or villain. You'll see examples of both approaches in best-selling books. For example, Harry Potter has a very clear villain in Voldemort, but a novel like The Fault in Our Stars does not have a clear villain character. In that case, the characters are really grappling with the threat of cancer and death. And there isn't a person necessarily to blame. There isn't a person that we as the reader hate throughout the story. Again, both approaches are totally valid. So if your story does not have a villain character, do not worry, it might not need one. The last tip of bad writing advice is write what you want to read. I actually hate this piece of writing advice for a couple of reasons. I really don't think your personal writing style or even the genre that you're writing in necessarily has to match what you enjoy reading for pleasure. And two, I think it's okay and maybe even good for your readers to have a different taste or be a different demographic than yourself. You should not feel required to conflate your personal identity and your personal tastes with whatever you're writing. Remember that this is your creative craft, this is your creative output, but it does not define who you are as a person or even necessarily what you like as a person outside of writing. So I would personally revise this piece of writing advice to say, write the book that you want to write, not necessarily the book that you want to read. I hope these tips help you ignore all these pieces of bad writing advice floating out there. Just put them out of your mind and reset and listen to what actually helps you strengthen your own story. Everyone's story and everyone's process is unique and different, and you should only take the pieces of writing advice that resonate and work for you. Let me know in the comments what other pieces of bad writing advice you've heard either online or from friends or critique partners. I'd love to hear your thoughts on them. And if you're looking for more writing tips, I recommend checking out my video on mistakes to catch in your own manuscript. I go through some tactical things you can actually check for in your own draft and fix them to make your story even stronger. And as always, if you found this video helpful, please hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. It means a lot to me and helps me know that I'm bringing you content that you find interesting and helps me grow this community. Thanks so much for watching and happy writing.